Welcome back to the deep dive. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today we're tackling Jewish perspectives on homosexuality.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and we've got a fascinating source. Wrestling with God and Men by Rabbi Steven Greenberg.
I've heard of that one. It's supposed to be pretty thought-provoking.
It is. It really dives deep, going through biblical texts, Talmudic interpretations, even some historical context, which is always interesting.
What strikes me about Rabbi Greenberg is that, well, he's not just some, scholar looking in from the outside. He's an openly gay Orthodox rabbi.
Right. So he's writing from a place of both personal experience and deep knowledge of the tradition.
Exactly. He's really living this intersection of identity and faith.
It makes you wonder what his journey was like, reconciling those two parts of himself.
Well, he actually talks about creating a gay men's study group in Jerusalem.
Wait, a gay men's study group in Jerusalem?
Yeah. It was called Moa Gavra, which means male mind.
Wow. Just picturing that, a group of gay men intensely studying Torah in Jerusalem. That's quite an image.
Definitely not what most people picture when they think about Orthodox Judaism.
So how does he approach this topic in the book? Does he start with the typical love is love argument?
Actually, he goes much deeper than that, like way back to the beginning, to the Genesis creation stories.
Okay, so we're talking foundational stuff here. What does he say about Genesis?
Well, he brings up this Midrashic interpretation where the first human being is actually androgynous.
Androgynous, like both male and female.
Exactly. Not just male, not just female, but a combination of both.
That's fascinating. So what does that say about the traditional view that heterosexuality is, the original plan?
It kind of throws a wrench in that whole idea, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests that maybe God's original vision for humanity was more fluid than we typically think.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about how he uses this idea of androgyny to explore relationships.
Well, he points to the relationship between Rabbis Yohanan and Resh Lakish. They have this incredibly intense bond.
Like a romantic relationship?
Not necessarily romantic, no, but the text describes their connection as iser negdo, which means helper, opposite, or against him. Rabbi Greenberg interprets this as a kind of helpful opposition. Think about a friend who constantly challenges you, pushes you to think differently. It's not romantic, but it's definitely intense and important.
I see. So he's suggesting that meaningful relationships can exist outside of the traditional romantic framework.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that those relationships can be just as valuable, even transformative.
That's pretty radical considering the emphasis on marriage and family in traditional Judaism.
It is. And it opens up a whole new way of thinking about what constitutes a valid and meaningful relationship.
Okay, so if Genesis isn't as clear-cut on heterosexuality as some people might think, what other examples does he give?
Well, he talks about homoerotic poetry from medieval Spain.
Wait, homoerotic poetry from medieval Spain? Seriously?
Yeah. We're talking poets like Moshe Ibn Ezra and Judah Halevi. They were expressing their love and desire for men in their work. And this wasn't just, hidden away in some secret journal. It was right there in their art.
Wow, that's amazing. So we're not just talking about modern interpretations here. This goes way back.
Exactly. And then there's the story of Kalonymus ben Kalonymus, a 13th century writer who literally wrote a prayer to God asking to be transformed into a woman.
Wow. A prayer to become a woman in the 13th century.
Yeah.
Talk about pushing boundaries.
He was definitely ahead of his time.
I can't imagine that went over well with the, religious authorities of the time.
Not exactly. But it does show us that these feelings, these desires, have existed within Jewish tradition for centuries.
It seems like Rabbi Greenberg is saying, hey, look, this isn't something new. It's been a part of our story all along.
Exactly. And maybe it's time we start acknowledging that more openly.
Okay, I'm all in on these hidden gems from Jewish history. But what about those passages that explicitly condemn homosexuality? The ones people often use to say it's wrong.
Yes. We can't avoid the elephant in the room, right?
Yeah.
Leviticus 18.22.
The big one. The verse everyone always brings up.
The one that often causes a lot of pain and tension. But Rabbi Greenberg doesn't shy away from it.
So how does he handle such a sensitive and often divisive verse?
He approaches it with nuance, and he challenges the traditional interpretation.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more.
Well, he suggests that the verse might actually be condemning sexual acts motivated by power and degradation, not necessarily all same-sex relationships.
So it's not about who you love, but how you express that love.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that the act is respectful, consensual, and doesn't involve any kind of exploitation or abuse.
That's a very different way of looking at it.
It is. And he even points to the Hebrew wording of the verse, arguing that the way the word et is used could change the entire interpretation.
Okay, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of biblical Hebrew.
He suggests that it might be more about inclusion than exclusion.
Wow. So we're talking about looking beyond the surface level, really digging into the nuances of the language.
And that's just the beginning. Rabbi Greenberg goes on to explore a whole range of rabbinic opinions on homosexuality throughout history.
So there's not just one monolithic Jewish view on this.
Definitely not. He contrasts Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's very strict interpretation with Rabbi Noah Weinberg's more nuanced approach.
Wasn't Rabbi Weinberg the one who compared breaking the Sabbath laws with engaging in homosexual acts?
Yes, both are technically forbidden, but they're not necessarily viewed with the same level of severity in practice.
That's a really thought-provoking comparison. It makes you wonder how we decide which commandments are more important than others, and what it means to strive for observance within our own capacity.
Exactly. And that's where things get even more interesting, as we'll explore in part 2 of this deep dive. So where do we go from here? How do we apply all these different interpretations and historical perspectives to the real world?
Right. It's one thing to talk about ancient texts and rabbinic debates, but how does all this translate into actual change within a community that, let's be honest, can be pretty traditional?
Well, Rabbi Greenberg tackles this head-on. He talks about how Jewish law has adapted to changing social and economic realities in the past.
Okay, give me an example. I'm all about those historical parallels.
He uses the example of usury laws, the prohibition against lending money with interest.
Yeah, it was seen as exploitative, right? Taking advantage of people in need.
Exactly. But as economies became more complex, there was a need for different types of loans, like business loans, to help people get started. So the rabbis had to figure out how to reconcile this new reality with the existing prohibition.
So they just threw out the rule.
Not quite. They got creative. They developed this system called Heder Iska, which essentially reframed certain loans as business partnerships. Instead of a traditional loan with interest, it's more like investing in a venture and sharing in the profits.
So they found a way to maintain the core values of the law, protecting the vulnerable while also adapting to the changing economic landscape. That's pretty clever, but can you really apply that same logic to something as, well, personal as sexuality?
That's what Rabbi Greenberg is suggesting. Though he acknowledges it's not a simple one-to-one comparison. It's a lot more complex, and there's bound to be pushback. Imagine trying to convince people that centuries of tradition need to be, well, revisited.
It makes you think about how attached we can get to our own interpretations, even when they might be causing harm or excluding others. But isn't there a danger in constantly reinterpreting things? Do we risk losing the essence of tradition?
It's a valid concern, and Rabbi Greenberg addresses it. He emphasizes the importance of approaching this with empathy and dialogue. It's not about forcing change on people, but about engaging in meaningful conversations and listening to the experiences of LGBTQ individuals.
So it's more about rabbis truly listening and understanding the lived experiences of those within their communities, right?
Yeah, exactly. He shares some pretty powerful anecdotes in his book, personal stories of how these halakhic decisions impact real people's lives, their relationships, their sense of belonging.
Like with Shmuel, the Satmar Hasid who left the community, it's one thing to talk about abstract concepts, but when you hear a story like his, it becomes so much more real, so much more human.
It reminds us that these aren't just theoretical debates. They have real-world consequences.
Yeah.
And that's where those concepts of ones and Tinok Shenishba come in. They offer a framework for understanding and accommodating homosexuality within Orthodox Judaism.
Okay, remind me about those terms again. They sound pretty heavy-duty.
Right. So ones basically means duress. Think of it like this. Imagine you're so hungry that you're about to faint. Jewish law allows you to break the fast in that situation, even though it's normally forbidden.
So it's like an exception to the rule because of extreme circumstances.
Exactly. Rabbi Greenberg suggests that this concept could apply to some individuals struggling with same-sex attraction. The desire might feel so overwhelming, so beyond their control, that it's considered a form of duress.
So it's not about giving people a free pass, but about recognizing that sometimes their circumstances might mitigate their culpability.
Exactly. And then there's Tinok Shenishba, which literally means captured child. It refers to someone raised outside of Jewish observance who might not be held to the same standards. Imagine someone raised on a deserted island with no concept of traffic laws.
They wouldn't know any better.
Right. You wouldn't hold them fully accountable for running a red light.
I see. So Rabbi Greenberg is suggesting that some individuals raised in extremely strict environments without exposure to alternative perspectives on homosexuality might fall under this category.
He uses the example of Shmuel again, the Satmar Hasid.
Hmm.
He argues that people like Shmuel deserve compassion and understanding because their choices were shaped by their upbringing.
It's like saying, hey, they didn't have access to the same information or experiences. We can't judge them by the same standards.
And it ties into this idea of teshuvah, of repentance. It's not just about blindly following rules, but about acknowledging the impact of our actions on others and striving for improvement.
So it's more about meeting people where they are and supporting their journey rather than condemning them for their struggles.
Exactly. And that's where Rabbi Noah Weinberg's comparison of Shabbat violations and homosexual acts becomes really interesting. He emphasizes individual striving, recognizing that everyone is at a different point on their path.
Right, but isn't that a radical idea, to suggest that there's room for flexibility in how we approach these commandments?
It might seem radical, but Rabbi Weinberg wasn't advocating for abandoning halakha altogether. It's more about recognizing that there's a spectrum of observance.
So instead of focusing on condemnation, we should focus on supporting people's efforts to live in accordance with their values, even if that process looks different for everyone.
Exactly. And that brings us to the question of how to create a more inclusive and welcoming Jewish community. What does that look like in practice?
Okay, let's get practical. What are some concrete steps that synagogues and communities can take?
Well, Rabbi Greenberg suggests starting with simple things, like being mindful of language, avoiding assumptions about marital status or family structure.
So, like, not automatically assuming everyone is married or has kids.
Right. You never know what someone's personal situation is or how they identify. And beyond language, it's about creating social events and programming that are inclusive of LGBTQ individuals and families.
Making sure everyone feels seen and valued, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. That sounds great in theory, but what about those who are resistant to these changes? They're bound to be people who feel uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And Rabbi Greenberg doesn't sugarcoat that. He emphasizes approaching these conversations with respect and humility, recognizing that people come to these issues with deeply held beliefs and values.
So how do you engage with those who might disagree, who might even see these ideas as a threat to their way of life?
He suggests framing the discussion within the context of shared values. Rather than focusing on points of contention, highlight the common ground.
So instead of an us versus them mentality, it's more about we're all part of this community and we all care about its future.
Exactly. Emphasize the commitment to Jewish tradition, the desire for a thriving community, the belief in the inherent dignity of every individual.
It's about building bridges rather than walls. But is that really possible when dealing with such deeply ingrained beliefs?
Rabbi Greenberg is a firm believer in the power of dialogue. He acknowledges it's a long-term process. It won't happen overnight. There will be setbacks and frustrations.
So it's not about expecting everyone to suddenly change their minds, but about creating a space for ongoing conversation and understanding.
Exactly. And recognizing that the journey itself is valuable. Even if we don't always agree, the act of engaging in these conversations can draw us closer together.
It's like that concept of Ezer Negbo again, that helpful opposition. Even when we disagree, those different perspectives can challenge us to think more deeply and expand our understanding.
It's about having the courage to wrestle with these difficult questions, even when there are no easy answers.
This has been an incredible exploration of tradition, identity, and community. We've gone from reinterpreting ancient texts to discussing real-world changes in synagogues and communities.
And we're not done yet. There's still more to uncover.
Back again for the final part of our deep dive. This has been quite a journey.
It has. Rabbi Greenberg really pushes us to think deeply about these issues.
He does. And in this final section, he goes even further, challenging some pretty fundamental assumptions about homosexuality within Jewish thought.
You know, we talked about reinterpreting Leviticus, considering individual circumstances, but he doesn't stop there. He tackles this idea that male-male intercourse is inherently linked to humiliation and domination.
That's the traditional interpretation of Leviticus 18.22, right? The one often used to condemn homosexuality. I thought we already covered that.
We did, but now he takes it a step further. He argues that the verse might actually be targeting acts that are inherently degrading and exploitative, regardless of the gender of the people involved.
So it's not about who you're with, but the nature of the act itself, whether it involves power, control, a lack of respect for the other person's dignity.
Precisely. It raises the question, Have some interpretations focused too much on the gender aspect and missed the deeper message about ethical behavior.
It makes you think.
He uses the story of Ham and Noah to illustrate this point.
Oh, right. Ham sees his father Noah naked and is cursed for it.
Yeah. Traditionally, the focus has been on the impropriety of seeing one's father naked.
But I remember some interpretations suggesting something more might have been going on.
Exactly. Rabbi Greenberg dives into those rabbinic interpretations that suggest there might have been a deeper violation.
Like sexual assault.
It's a difficult topic,
Oh.
and he handles it sensitively. But he uses this interpretation to highlight the theme of power and violation.
Connecting it back to the discussion of Leviticus 18.22.
Right. So the real sin isn't necessarily about homosexuality, but about using power to harm or exploit another person.
Regardless of gender.
Exactly. It challenges us to think beyond the surface level, to consider the deeper implications of the stories and the laws,
To read between the lines.
and be willing to consider different interpretations.
You know, it makes you wonder how many other passages have been misinterpreted or taken out of context over time. Not just in the Torah, but in other religious texts as well.
It's a thought-provoking question. And Rabbi Greenberg doesn't shy away from addressing how our understanding of natural has changed.
We think differently now than we did centuries ago.
Exactly. He challenges this idea that procreation is the only valid purpose of a sexual relationship.
You mean that idea that if a relationship can't produce children, it's somehow less legitimate?
Right. He reminds us that the Torah acknowledges the pleasure aspect of sex as well.
Well, yeah, the Song of Songs is pretty explicit about that.
Exactly. It's a celebration of erotic love and intimacy, not just a manual for procreation.
It's like he's saying, hey, God created us with the capacity for pleasure, and that's not something to be ashamed of or deny.
Right. And by acknowledging that pleasure is part of God's design, we can start to dismantle this idea that same-sex relationships are inherently sinful or unnatural.
Simply because they don't lead to procreation.
Right. But then the question becomes, how do you reconcile that with the traditional emphasis on family?
On carrying on the lineage. Those are pretty core values in Judaism.
They are. And Rabbi Greenberg acknowledges that. He's not saying those values are wrong, just that maybe our definition of natural and family needs to expand.
To be more inclusive.
Yes, to recognize that there are many ways to create meaningful relationships and families.
He even talks about the tum-tum and the androgynos, right? Those individuals born with ambiguous genitalia.
Yeah, those examples are fascinating. The fact that they were recognized within Jewish law, with specific rulings and guidelines, shows that the tradition has always acknowledged that human sexuality isn't always so clear-cut.
It suggests there's precedent within the tradition for recognizing variations in human sexuality.
It's not this new modern phenomenon,
It's always been there.
even if it wasn't always openly discussed.
Rabbi Greenberg really pushes us to see that religious law isn't fixed and immutable, which I imagine makes some people uncomfortable.
It does. If the laws can change, what does that mean for our faith, our understanding of God's will?
It can be a scary thought.
It can. But Rabbi Greenberg points to how Jewish law has evolved on issues like slavery and usury. Things that were once accepted are now seen as completely wrong.
So if we could reinterpret those laws, why not apply that same logic to homosexuality?
Exactly. Halakha is a living tradition, a dynamic system that adapts to changing circumstances,
And the interpretation of those laws is a human endeavor.
shaped by our understanding of the world.
And our own biases.
It's not about saying that the old interpretations were wrong,
Just that our understanding of the world has grown.
and we might need to revisit those interpretations with fresh eyes,
It takes a certain level of humility to admit that we don't have all the answers.
and that our understanding can evolve over time.
It's a powerful message, but I imagine it's a difficult one for some people to accept.
It is. Uncertainty can be scary, especially when it comes to matters of faith.
But Rabbi Greenberg seems to be saying that it's precisely that wrestling, that grappling with the tough questions that keeps tradition alive and relevant.
It's not about blindly following the rules. It's about engaging with our faith on a deeper level, questioning, challenging, and ultimately growing. And that growth happens in community, through dialogue, through sharing our experiences and perspectives.
So it's not just about changing the laws, but changing the culture. Creating a space where LGBTQ individuals feel welcomed, affirmed for who they are.
Exactly. And Rabbi Greenberg offers practical suggestions for how synagogues can become more inclusive, Simple things, being mindful of language, avoiding assumptions about marital status, creating social events and programs that are inclusive.
It's about recognizing that LGBTQ individuals are a part of the community, not a separate entity.
It's about integration, not segregation.
Creating support systems for LGBTQ individuals and their families, helping them navigate the complexities of their faith and identity.
It's a multifaceted approach, addressing the legal aspects, but also the social and emotional needs.
It sounds like a lot of work, and there will be people who resist those changes.
Rabbi Greenberg stresses the importance of patience and dialogue. He reminds us that lasting change takes time.
It's not about forcing people to change their minds. It's about planting seeds, creating a climate where understanding and compassion can flourish.
It takes faith. Faith in the power of dialogue, faith in the goodness of people, and faith in the possibility of a more inclusive and loving future.
This has been such an incredible deep dive. We've covered so much, from ancient texts to modern-day challenges. And through it all, Rabbi Greenberg's voice has been a guiding light.
He's challenged us to think critically, to wrestle with difficult questions, and ultimately to envision a more inclusive and compassionate Jewish community.
It's been a privilege exploring these ideas with you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.